Hey guys, tonight we're taking a journey back to ancient Rome, but we're not focusing on the grand emperors, the mighty legions, or the impressive architecture. No. Tonight we're shining a light on a much darker, far more common, and frankly, absolutely terrible aspect of Roman life slavery. You're not going to be wearing a fancy toga or commanding an army. Instead, you're about to step into the worn sandals of someone who has lost everything, someone stripped of their identity and freedom. And trust me, if you were actually in this situation, you'd probably realize pretty quickly that modern conveniences are vastly preferable. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And, hey, let me know where you're listening from tonight, and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing on a dusty, bustling road, the noise of a Roman town assaulting your senses, but you're not a free person. You're a prisoner, a captive, fresh from a conquered land. Your clothes are ragged, your hair matted with dirt and sweat, and your stomach aches with a gnawing emptiness. This is one of the most common ways to become a Roman slave capture in war. Rome was a vast, expanding empire, and with every conquest came a fresh influx of human beings deemed property, the spoils of victory. You were simply a statistic, one more body in a long line, marched across vast distances, often chained to others, towards an uncertain and terrifying future. Imagine the sheer terror and disorientation. One day you're a farmer, a craftsman, a soldier, living your life in your village, speaking your language, following your customs. The next, your world is shattered, your home is burned, your family scattered or worse, and you're dragged away by an overwhelming foreign force. You don't understand their language, their laws, or their intentions. All you know is that your freedom, your very identity, has been ripped away. You are no longer you. You are a thing, an object. But war wasn't the only path to servitude. Perhaps you were born into it. If your mother was a slave, then you, by Roman law, were also a slave from birth, regardless of your father's status. This created a self-perpetuating system, a grim inheritance passed down through generations. You might never have known freedom, never tasted true autonomy. Your entire existence, from your first breath, was dictated by the will of another. This inherited status was a fundamental pillar of Roman slavery, ensuring a constant supply of domestic slaves without relying solely on conquests. Or maybe you fell into debt. In early Roman history, debt slavery, or nexum, was a very real possibility. If you couldn't pay back a loan, you might be forced to work off your debt. While nexum became less common and eventually outlawed in later periods, the broader concept of economic vulnerability remained a threat. A poor farmer might be forced to sell his children into slavery just to survive a famine. Or a desperate family might sell themselves to escape destitution. It was a brutal calculus of survival, where human dignity was a luxury few could afford. You might also be a victim of piracy or kidnapping. Despite Rome's naval power, pirates still roamed the seas, preying on vulnerable coastal communities and lone travelers. They would capture individuals and sell them into slavery, often in distant lands where no one would know them or seek their return. Imagine the terror of being seized from your ship or your home, spirited away, and then paraded in a foreign market, utterly at the mercy of your captors. Once you became a slave, your previous life vanished. Your name, your family, your skills, they mattered little, or only if they served your new master. You would often be given a new Roman name, a generic label like Primus, first, or Secundus, second, or perhaps a name related to your origin, like Sirius or Dacus. This act of renaming was a powerful symbolic gesture, a final severance from your past identity. You were now a blank slate, to be written upon by your owner. Think about the psychological impact, the constant fear, the loss of agency, the complete uncertainty. You are entirely dependent on the whims of your master, who holds absolute power over your life, your body, and your future. There are no legal rights, no appeals, no recourse. Your very being is subject to another's will. This dehumanization was fundamental to the institution of Roman slavery, allowing free Romans to justify their ownership of other human beings. The popular notion that Roman slavery was not as bad as other forms, because slaves could sometimes earn freedom, is a dangerous oversimplification. While manumission, the act of freeing a slave, did exist, it was by no means a guarantee, and the vast majority of slaves lived and died in bondage. Moreover, even when freedom was granted, it was often at the master's discretion, and usually after years, if not decades, of arduous, unpaid labor, and even then, a freed slave, or libertus, still carried the stigma of their past, often retaining certain obligations to their former master. One lesser-known detail about becoming a slave was the medical inspection at the point of sale. Before being purchased, you would be examined like livestock. Your teeth, your muscles, your overall physical condition would be assessed to determine your value and your suitability for different types of labor. Any scars, any signs of weakness, or any hint of a defiant spirit might lower your price or condemn you to a harsher existence. It's a chilling detail, highlighting the complete commodification of human life. Historians still debate the exact numbers, but it's widely believed that at various points, slaves constituted a significant portion, perhaps even one-third, of the total population of the Roman Empire, especially in cities like Rome itself. This meant that the Roman way of life, from its grand villas to its public works, was built on the backs of enslaved people. Their forced labor fueled the economy, maintained households, and built the very structures that still stand today. So, as you step into this ancient world, remember that your status is not one of privilege or power. You are an object, a piece of property, a tool. Your past is erased, your future uncertain. This is the grim reality of becoming a Roman slave, the terrifying first step into a life of servitude. You're no longer reeling from the shock of losing your freedom. Now, you're deeply immersed in the relentless, often monotonous, rhythm of a Roman urban slave's life. The sun rises, and you're already awake. The quiet of the pre-dawn hours replaced by the stirrings of a large Roman household. Your day is not your own. Every moment, every action, is dictated by the needs and whims of your master and his family. Imagine yourself in a sprawling domus, a grand Roman villa within the city walls. You might be a domestic slave, one of many. Perhaps you're a pedisiquus, following your master around, carrying his scrolls or adjusting his toga. Or maybe you're a vestiplica, carefully folding and maintaining the family's expensive garments, ensuring they are spotless and perfectly draped. The work is constant, often thankless, and demands meticulous attention to detail. Every spill, every misplaced item, could lead to a sharp rebuke, or worse. Your day begins before dawn. You might be responsible for lighting the lamps, stoking the kitchen fires, or preparing the master's morning meal. The air fills with the smell of wood smoke, baking bread, and the unique aroma of Roman cooking. You move through the house with practiced efficiency, your steps silent, your presence largely unnoticed unless something goes awry. You are, in essence, part of the furniture, a living tool in the intricate machinery of the Roman household. Think about the sheer variety of tasks. You could be a cubicularius, tending to your master's private chambers, ensuring his bed is made, his clothes laid out, his personal effects organized, or perhaps a fornax, working in the kitchen, grinding grain, preparing exotic ingredients, and toiling over hot ovens in stifling heat. The kitchen would be a chaotic, noisy environment, a stark contrast to the elegant dining rooms your food would eventually reach. You'd probably spend half your time trying not to trip over your fellow slaves or scullery implements. The demands aren't just physical, they're also mental. You must anticipate your master's needs, understand his moods, and navigate the complex social hierarchy of the household, which included other slaves, freedmen, and the master's family. A smart slave learned to observe, to listen, and to become almost invisible when not directly needed. This constant vigilance was exhausting, a perpetual state of being on call. One common misconception is that all urban slaves had it easy compared to rural or mine slaves. While certainly better than the living hell of the mines, urban slavery still presented its own unique challenges. You might live in cramped, dark quarters, often sharing a small room with several other slaves, with little privacy or personal space. Your diet, while perhaps more varied than that of a rural slave, would still be basic, focused on sustenance rather than enjoyment. And the psychological burden of being constantly watched, constantly judged, was immense. Consider the highly specialized roles some urban slaves held. You could be a librarius, copying texts in a private library, a task requiring literacy and a steady hand. Or an ornatrix, skilled in hairstyling and applying cosmetics for the ladies of the house. Some slaves were highly educated, serving as tutors for the children pedagogus, or as accountants dispensator managing the family's finances. These roles might offer a degree of prestige and better treatment, but you were still property. Your intellectual abilities merely another asset for your master to exploit. Historians still debate the true extent of affection or empathy between Roman masters and their urban slaves. While some inscriptions suggest genuine bonds, and some wills show masters freeing beloved slaves, these were likely exceptions rather than the norm. The fundamental power imbalance meant that even kind masters still held absolute control, with the right to punish, sell, or even kill their slaves. It was a relationship built on ownership, not equality. You might be treated well, but always with the understanding that your fate was never truly your own. Beyond private households, urban slaves toiled in countless other capacities. You could be working in a workshop officina, producing pottery, textiles, or metal goods. The rhythm of your day would be dictated by the demands of production, the repetitive motions of your craft, under the watchful eye of an overseer, or perhaps in a shop taberna, serving customers, stocking shelves, and haggling prices for your master. Imagine standing all day, catering to demanding Roman citizens, all while knowing you earned nothing for your labor. One particularly grueling detail of urban slavery was the public works. Thousands of slaves were owned by the Roman state and put to work on massive construction projects building roads, aqueducts, sewers, and grand public buildings. This was physically demanding labor, often performed under harsh conditions, exposed to the elements, and with little respite. You might be hauling heavy stones, digging trenches, or mixing mortar, all for the glory of Rome, none for your own benefit. It was a testament to Roman organization, but a tragic one built on forced labor. Life as an urban slave, while varied, shared common threads: constant labor, lack of personal autonomy, and the pervasive threat of punishment. You lived in the shadow of your master's authority, your very existence defined by your servitude. Every meal, every moment of rest, every piece of clothing you wore was a gift, not a right. It was a life lived on the periphery, essential to the functioning of Roman society, yet utterly devoid of true freedom. You're no longer surrounded by the relative bustle of the city domus or the workshop's rhythmic clang. Instead, the air is thick with the scent of damp earth, sweat, and distant livestock. The sun beats down with a relentless intensity, and your back aches, a dull, constant throb that seems to have settled deep into your bones. This is the brutal, monotonous existence of a Roman agricultural slave, toiling on a vast latifundium, a massive agricultural estate, where life was stripped down to its most basic and most grueling form. Imagine waking before the sun, in a cramped, often windowless barrack shared with dozens of other slaves. The air is stale, heavy with the smell of unwashed bodies and rough straw. There's no time for a proper meal. Perhaps just a piece of hard bread or some watery gruel before you're herded out into the fields by the overseer. Often a villicus, a slave manager, or a cruel actor, farm manager who was usually a freedman, but sometimes a slave himself. His whip is a constant, visible threat, and its sharp crack can cut through the morning mist, reminding you of your place. Your days are endless cycles of backbreaking labor. If it's harvest season, you're in the fields, sickle in hand, cutting wheat or barley under the scorching sun. The chaff gets into your eyes, your throat, and the dust chokes you. You bend, cut, bundle, and repeat, hour after agonizing hour, until your muscles scream in protest. There are no breaks, no respite, only the relentless demand to meet the day's quota. Your body becomes a machine, an implement, used until it breaks. If it's olive season, you're beating the trees, collecting the fallen fruit, or perhaps crushing olives in a primitive press, the oil slick and fragrant, but never for your own use. If it's grape season, you're pruning vines, tending the sprawling vineyards, or, in one of the few, slightly less back-breaking tasks, treading grapes in the vats, their juice staining your feet. Every crop, every season, brings a new form of physical torment. You're always dirty, always tired, and perpetually hungry. Think about the sheer scale of these latifundia. They were vast, often hundreds or even thousands of acres, owned by wealthy senators or equestrian-class Romans who might rarely visit their properties. Absentee landlords meant that the direct control and often the cruelty were delegated to overseers, who had little incentive to be lenient. Their job was to maximize production and minimize cost. And the easiest way to do that was to push the slaves to their absolute limits. You can almost feel the endless stretch of fields, a silent testament to the vast, unseen labor powering the Roman economy. One common, and truly awful, practice was the use of slave gangs in chains, particularly in the early Republic and during the Punic Wars. When large numbers of captives were taken, slaves performing heavy agricultural labor were often chained together, even at night. This practice, known as compediti or vincti, was meant to prevent escape and maximize collective output. Imagine the chafing of the iron, the constant drag of the chains, the absolute lack of dignity, even when sleeping. This brutal image, though it lessened in later periods, highlights the extreme measures masters would take to control their human property. Your diet would be meager and monotonous, perhaps coarse bread, olives, figs, and a little wine, supplemented by whatever vegetables or wild greens you could forage in secret. Meat was a rare luxury, often only provided if you were a stronger male slave used for heavier labor. Malnutrition was common, weakening bodies already pushed to their limits, making them more susceptible to disease. Sickness, for a slave, was often a death sentence, as medical care was rudimentary or non-existent for those at the bottom of the social ladder. Historians still debate the true economic efficiency of large-scale chattel slavery in Roman agriculture. While it provided a massive free labor force, it also disincentivized innovation and often led to land exhaustion due to unsustainable farming practices. The emphasis was on immediate profit rather than long-term sustainability or human welfare. You can almost feel the parched earth, bearing witness to generations of forced, unsustainable labor. The sleeping quarters, or ergastula, were often underground, windowless cells, more like dungeons than dormitories. They were designed for security, to prevent escape, not for comfort or health. The conditions would have been dark, damp, and unsanitary, a breeding ground for disease. You'd probably collapse onto a straw mat, too exhausted to even feel the gnawing hunger or the ache in your limbs, only to be roused again by the overseer's horn before dawn. One particularly grim detail is the concept of breeding slaves. On some larger estates, female slaves were encouraged or forced to have children, as these offspring automatically became the property of the master, representing a self-renewing supply of labor. While not a universal practice, it underscores the complete commodification of enslaved individuals, their very bodies and reproductive capacities exploited for economic gain. It's a chilling reminder that your humanity was utterly disregarded. Life on a Roman latifundium was a perpetual cycle of physical exhaustion, minimal sustenance, and constant threat. There was little hope for advancement, and escape was incredibly difficult and severely punished. You were living proof that the grandeur of Rome was built not just on its legions and its laws, but on the relentless, brutalized labor of millions of forgotten individuals. The fields stretched endlessly, and so, it seemed, did the days of unending servitude. You're no longer under the vast, oppressive sky of the latifundium, nor are you navigating the relative complexities of an urban household. Instead, you're descending. The air grows heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth, sulfur, and something metallic, something like fear and exhaustion. The light fades rapidly, replaced by the flickering, smoky glow of oil lamps. The sounds echo strangely. The rhythmic clink, clink, clink of pickaxes against rock, the scraping of shovels, and the faint, rasping coughs of countless men. This is the absolute abyss of Roman slavery, the mines and quarries. A hellish existence where life was short, brutal, and almost entirely devoid of hope. Imagine yourself in a cramped, dark tunnel, the ceiling barely high enough for you to stand upright. The air is stifling, suffocating, a mix of dust, stale breath, and the oppressive heat generated by hundreds of bodies toiling in close proximity. You are stripped down to a loincloth, your muscles screaming with every swing of a primitive pickaxe. Your skin is coated in grime, sweat, and the fine, abrasive dust of the rock you're attempting to extract. This isn't just work. It's a slow, agonizing process of self-destruction. The Romans needed vast quantities of stone for their monumental buildings, their aqueducts, their roads, and their fortifications. They needed precious metals, gold, silver, copper, tin, to mint their coins, craft their armor, and adorn their elite. And the cheapest, most readily available labor for these dangerous, back-breaking tasks was, of course, slaves. Often, these were prisoners of war from particularly rebellious regions, or criminals sentenced to forced labor in the mines, a punishment known as damnatio ad metalla. For them, it was often a death sentence. Think about the sheer physical toll. You're hacking away at hard rock, hour after agonizing hour, with inadequate tools and barely enough food to sustain your strength. The work is relentless. There are no shifts in the modern sense. You work until you drop, or until an overseer decides you've earned a moment's rest, which is rare. Your hands are raw, blistered, and perpetually bleeding. Your lungs burn from inhaling the rock dust, a constant irritant that would eventually lead to crippling respiratory diseases. You can almost feel the dull ache spreading from your shoulders down your arms, a persistent companion. The dangers were immense and ever-present. Tunnels could collapse without warning, burying dozens of men alive. Primitive ventilation meant suffocation was a real threat. Flooding was common in some mines, trapping workers in rising water. And the risk of injury from tools, falling rock, or the constant threat of a brutal overseer was a daily reality. A broken leg or a severe cut could mean abandonment, left to die in the dark, as you were simply too much trouble to mend. One particularly grim detail is the concept of child labor in the mines. While adults performed the heaviest labor, archaeological evidence and ancient texts suggest that children, due to their smaller size, were sometimes forced into narrow shafts or crevices that adults couldn't access. Imagine a young child, barely old enough to wield a pickaxe, crawling through a dark, claustrophobic tunnel, risking their life for mere scraps of sustenance. It's a chilling reminder of the complete disregard for human life in these environments. Your living conditions would be abysmal. You would sleep in crowded, unsanitary barracks, often directly within the mine complex, with little or no access to clean water or proper sanitation. Disease spread rapidly through these cramped, weakened populations. Dysentery, pneumonia, and various infections would sweep through the slave ranks, claiming lives with horrifying regularity. The lifespan of a mine slave was notoriously short, often just a few years. Historians still debate the precise number of slaves who perished in Roman mines, but it's clear the mortality rates were astronomically high. Seneca the Younger, a Roman philosopher, wrote of the mines as places from which there is no return. They were, in essence, death camps, designed to extract maximum labor until the human machine broke. You can almost smell the stench of disease and despair clinging to the damp rock walls. The overseers, often hardened and brutal, would drive the slaves mercilessly. Their incentives were simple: maximize output, minimize costs. Flogging, branding, and even mutilation were common punishments for perceived laziness or insubordination. There was no escape, no appeal, only the endless cycle of brutal labor and the dim, distant hope of release through death. You'd probably feel the constant prickle of anxiety, the subtle tension in your muscles, waiting for the overseer's shadow to fall across you. The produce of these mines, whether it was the gleaming gold from Spain or the rough granite from Egypt, powered the Roman Empire. The dazzling mosaics, the towering temples, the vast infrastructure, much of it was built on the suffering of these forgotten souls. The mines were the hidden engine of Roman prosperity, a testament to their engineering prowess but a stain on their moral fabric. Even the concept of suicide was sometimes considered a preferable alternative to continued existence in the mines. While certainly not common, accounts of slaves taking their own lives to escape the unbearable conditions underscore the absolute depths of despair experienced by these individuals. It's a chilling thought, a silent scream of desperation echoing through the ages. So, as the faint light of your oil lamp flickers and threatens to die, remember the chilling reality of the Roman mines. It was a place where humanity was stripped bare, reduced to mere muscle and bone, consumed by the earth it was forced to conquer. It was the absolute worst place to be a Roman slave. A stark reminder of the empire's reliance on unimaginable human suffering. You're no longer enveloped by the suffocating darkness of the mines. Instead, you're thrust into a cacophony of sound and a swirl of humanity. The air is filled with the shouts of auctioneers, the lowing of livestock, the nervous murmurs of onlookers, and the desperate silence of the people standing before them. This is the Roman slave market, a chilling tableau where human beings, including you, are reduced to mere commodities, inspected, prodded, and sold like any other piece of property. Imagine standing on a raised platform, perhaps a wooden stage, under the indifferent Roman sun. Your clothes are minimal, possibly just a coarse tunic or even less, to allow potential buyers to assess your physique. Your body is oiled to make your muscles gleam, to hide imperfections, to make you appear healthier, more appealing. You are a display, an item for sale, stripped not just of your clothing, but of your dignity. Your eyes scan the faces in the crowd, searching for any hint of kindness, any sign of what your future might hold, but mostly finding cold, calculating gazes. The auctioneer, or mangones, is a loud, boisterous figure, his voice booming as he extols the virtues of the merchandise. He might exaggerate your strengths, downplay your weaknesses, all to drive up the bidding. He'll declare your age, your origin, any skills you possess. Strong, healthy Thracian, excellent for farm labor, or educated Greek, skilled in accounts and tutoring. Your life story, your hopes, your fears. None of it matters. Only your potential utility. Think about the sheer objectification. Buyers will approach, sometimes even stepping onto the platform with you. They'll examine your teeth, check your hands for calluses, feel your muscles, perhaps even prod you with a stick. Women might be examined for their reproductive potential, their physical attractiveness. Children, standing beside their parents or alone, would also be subjected to this humiliating scrutiny. It's a dehumanizing experience, where your very body is reduced to a set of marketable attributes. You can almost feel the cold, impersonal touch of a potential buyer's hand on your arm, assessing your value. The conditions of sale were ruthless. There were no guarantees, though sometimes a seller might provide a warranty against certain defects for a short period. If you had a hidden illness, a bad temper, or a tendency to run away, the seller might be obligated to take you back or offer a discount. This was particularly true for more expensive slaves, highlighting that even human property came with a basic form of consumer protection for the buyer, not for the sold. It's a bizarre thought, isn't it? A warranty for a human being? One interesting, though morbid, detail is the practice of foot chalking. Slaves who were brought from overseas, and thus considered less familiar with Roman ways or potentially more rebellious, would often have their feet whitened with chalk. This was a visual signal to potential buyers, indicating their foreign origin and, by implication, their perceived lower value or higher risk. It was a subtle yet powerful mark of distinction, branding you before you were even sold. Historians still debate the ethical justifications or lack thereof that Romans employed for slavery. While some philosophers occasionally questioned the institution, it was overwhelmingly accepted as a natural and necessary part of their society and economy. The idea that certain people were naturally fit for slavery, or that conquest justified enslavement, was deeply ingrained. You might hear the murmurings of the crowd, their casual indifference to the human tragedy unfolding before them, a chilling testament to how deeply ingrained the institution was. The prices for slaves varied enormously depending on their age, sex, skills, health, and origin. A healthy, strong male with agricultural skills might fetch a good price, while a highly educated Greek tutor or a skilled artisan could command a fortune. Children were often cheaper, seen as a long-term investment. The sale of a beautiful young woman could provoke fierce bidding, not for her labor, but for her potential as a concubine or domestic servant. It was a bizarre economy where human lives were assigned a precise monetary value, openly discussed and haggled over. Imagine the agonizing wait, the uncertainty of who your new master would be. Would they be cruel or lenient? Would you be sent to the brutal fields or the slightly less harsh urban household? Would you be separated from any family members or friends you might have left? Every bid was a step further into the unknown, a roll of the dice with your entire future at stake. Sometimes, if you were deemed particularly troublesome or prone to running away, you might even be sold with a visible collar that contained a small metal tag. These tags, some of which have been found by archaeologists, often bore inscriptions like, "Hold me, lest I flee, and return me to my master, so-and-so, at such and such location." It was a desperate, public plea for your recapture, a stark reminder of the absolute lack of freedom. This grim return policy for human beings highlights the pervasive fear of runaway slaves and the lengths masters went to prevent it. The slave market was a microcosm of Roman society, reflecting its hierarchies, its economy, and its brutal efficiency. It was a place where human beings were transformed into property, their inherent worth dismissed, their future determined by a hammer blow and a sum of sesterces. It was a truly terrible experience, a visceral reminder of what it meant to be bought and sold. You're no longer on the auction block, the whispers of the market fading behind you. Now, you're enveloped by a chilling, pervasive atmosphere of fear and absolute power. This is the grim reality of discipline, punishment, and control in Roman slavery, where your life, your body, and your very will are subject to the arbitrary whims of your master. There are no laws to protect you, no higher authority to appeal to. You are, quite simply, property, and your master can do with you as he pleases. Imagine living in a constant state of vigilance. Every word, every gesture, every moment of perceived idleness scrutinized. Your master's authority, known as dominium, was absolute. He held the power of life and death over you, the ius vitae nescisque. while outright killing of slaves became less common and eventually faced some legal restrictions in later periods of the empire, particularly under emperors like Hadrian. The threat was always there. More often, the punishment was physical, brutal, and designed to instill terror and enforce obedience. You can almost feel a knot of anxiety tightening in your stomach, a constant companion. Think about the myriad forms of punishment. For minor infractions, a dropped dish, a slow response, a whispered complaint. You might face a simple flogging with a rod or a whip. The pain would be searing, leaving welts and bruises that served as a public reminder of your transgression. More severe offenses, or acts of defiance, could lead to far worse. You might be hung up and beaten, or subjected to various forms of torture designed to break your spirit as much as your body. These aren't just stories. Archaeological evidence, like flogging marks on bones, tragically confirms the prevalence of such violence. Beyond physical pain, humiliation was a powerful tool of control. You might be forced to wear a specific uniform, shaved in a particular way, or given a brand mark if you were a repeat runaway. The purpose was to strip you of your dignity, to publicly mark you as a slave, reinforcing your inferior status. Imagine the shame, the crushing weight of public scorn every time you stepped out, every time you... One common and truly insidious form of control was the internal hierarchy among slaves. Masters often appointed certain slaves as overseers vilici in the countryside, or dispensators in urban households, granting them a degree of authority over their fellow bondsmen. This created a system where slaves often policed each other, fostering distrust and making collective resistance more difficult. A slave overseer might be crueler than the master, eager to prove his loyalty and maintain his precarious position of power. It's a classic divide-and-conquer strategy, keeping the enslaved population fragmented. Historians still debate the true prevalence of extreme cruelty versus more benign forms of slavery. While Roman law certainly allowed for horrific abuses, some masters might have opted for a more paternalistic approach, believing that well-treated slaves were more productive and less likely to rebel. However, this kindness was always conditional, always at the master's discretion, and never truly negated the fundamental lack of freedom or the threat of arbitrary violence. You might hear stories of both extremes, but the terror of the latter would always overshadow the former. The threat of sale was another potent deterrent. If you were deemed troublesome, rebellious, or simply unproductive, your master could sell you off, perhaps to a harsher existence in the mines, or on a distant rural estate. This meant forced separation from any loved ones you might have, any semblance of community you had built. It was a constant psychological weapon, keeping you compliant through the fear of losing everything, however little you had. Remember how you felt on the auction block. That fear never truly left you. For the most serious offenses, particularly repeated escape attempts or violent acts, the punishment was crucifixion. A slow and agonizing public death designed to serve as a brutal warning to others. While horrific, it was a relatively rare ultimate punishment, used to make a chilling example. The memory of the Spartacus rebellion and its brutal suppression, with thousands of crucified slaves lining the Appian Way, would have served as a grim historical precedent, constantly looming over any thought of defiance. Even subtle forms of control were pervasive. Slaves had no legal standing to testify against their masters in court, and any testimony they did give could only be extracted under torture. This effectively silenced them, preventing any legal challenge to their treatment. They could not own property, enter into contracts, or marry legally, though contubernium, a de facto marriage between slaves, was common. It held no legal recognition. These restrictions cemented their status as non-persons in the eyes of the law. One particularly disturbing detail is the use of slave collars for runaways, which we touched on before. These metal collars were not just a mark of shame but a practical tool for recapture, turning any citizen into a potential bounty hunter. The constant feeling of being marked, of being hunted, would have been an unbearable psychological burden, It's a stark illustration of the lengths to which the Roman system went to ensure its human property remained just that property. So, life as a Roman slave was defined by a pervasive system of control, enforced by the constant threat of brutal punishment. It was a life lived on the knife's edge, where obedience was paramount and defiance carried horrifying consequences. Your body was not your own, your will was suppressed, and your very existence was dictated by the power of another. You're no longer living under the constant shadow of the lash or the auctioneer's cry. Instead, a faint flicker of light, a distant, almost impossible hope, appears on the horizon. Freedom. This is the journey of manumission, the complex and often arduous path that a Roman slave might take to escape the bonds of servitude. A rare and precious gift that came with its own set of unique challenges. Imagine years, perhaps decades, of unremitting toil. Your body is weary, your spirit perhaps a little dulled by the grind, but deep within you, the desire for autonomy burns. For many slaves, manumission, the formal act of being freed by a master, was the ultimate aspiration. It wasn't a universal right, or even a common occurrence for the vast majority, but it was a possibility, however remote, that kept some glimmer of hope alive. You can almost feel the longing for it, a quiet yearning amidst the daily struggle. The most common way for a slave to gain freedom was through the master's will. A master, on his deathbed, might choose to free certain slaves, often those who had served him loyally for many years, or those who had performed exceptional service. This was a posthumous act of benevolence, perhaps motivated by genuine affection, or by a desire to secure a good reputation in the afterlife, or simply to reward faithful service. Imagine the tense wait as the will was read, your fate hanging on the words of a deceased man. Another significant path to manumission was through purchase. A slave might, through incredible thrift and extra labor, perhaps being allowed to keep a small portion of earnings, known as peculium, save enough money to buy their own freedom. Or a sympathetic friend or family member who was already free might purchase them. This was a long, painstaking process, requiring immense discipline and sacrifice, as every sesterce saved was a step closer to liberty. Think about the years of denying yourself even the smallest comforts, all for that single, invaluable goal. A master could also free a slave inter amicos, among friends, by simply declaring them free in front of witnesses. This was a less formal but still legally recognized method. Another, more public way was manumissio censu, where the slave was entered into the Roman census as a free citizen, usually at the master's behest. These acts of public manumission were often performed to highlight the master's generosity or to provide a newly freed individual with full legal standing. Historians still debate the true motivations behind widespread Roman manumission. Was it purely altruism? Economic pragmatism? As freed slaves often remained clients, providing services or support, or a way to integrate skilled labor into the broader economy while still maintaining social hierarchies. It was likely a complex mix of all these factors, demonstrating that even acts of kindness in Roman society often had underlying practical considerations. You might hear scholarly murmurs about the economic benefits of retaining liberty as clients, a subtle but persistent discussion among academics. Once freed, you became a libertas freedman or liberta freedwoman. While no longer legally property, your freedom came with strings attached. You still owed certain duties and obligations to your former master, now your patron. This could involve performing a certain number of days of labor, providing financial support, or simply showing deference and loyalty. You were a citizen, yes, but a second-class one, forever carrying the stigma of your past servitude. Your master, now your patron, still had a claim on a part of your life. Think about the challenges of life as a freed person. You were now responsible for your own livelihood, your own housing, your own food, while some freedmen, especially those with specialized skills or who had managed their peculium well, could achieve considerable wealth and influence. Many others struggled. The societal prejudice against former slaves, regardless of their success, was often strong. You might have gained your freedom, but you rarely shed the societal perception of your origins. You could own property, but your former master could still restrict your ability to dispose of it. One fascinating, often overlooked detail is the legal complexities surrounding manumission. There were laws governing how many slaves a master could free in his will, often a percentage, to prevent vast numbers of newly freed, potentially disruptive individuals. This highlights the Roman state's desire to control the process, to ensure that the release of slaves didn't destabilize the social order or flood the urban centers with too many poor, jobless freedmen. It shows a cautious approach to what might seem like a simple act of charity. Children of freed people, however, were born free and without the same obligations to the patron. This was the true generational freedom, the ultimate prize for a freed slave, knowing their offspring would not be born into bondage. It was a powerful incentive to earn freedom, not just for oneself, but for the legacy of one's descendants. The path to freedom for a Roman slave was never easy, and for many, it never came. But for those who achieved it, it was a moment of profound transformation, a hard-won victory against a system designed to deny them agency. It meant a life of newfound responsibilities, continuing obligations, and societal challenges. But crucially, it meant that your life was, at last, your own. It was a step into the light, even if that light cast long, lingering shadows of the past. You're no longer dreaming of freedom or navigating the complex world of manumission. Instead, the air crackles with tension, a palpable sense of anger and defiance. The whispers in the dark, the shared glances of desperation, are finally erupting into open revolt. This is the terrifying, yet sometimes exhilarating reality of rebellion and resistance in Roman slavery, where human beings, pushed to their absolute breaking point, dared to fight back against their oppressors. Imagine the sheer courage it would take. You are unarmed, untrained, and facing the most powerful military machine the world has ever known. Yet, the conditions of your servitude, the brutal beatings, the starvation, the endless labor, the constant dehumanization, have become so unbearable that the fear of death is less potent than the burning desire for vengeance and liberty. You can almost feel the surge of desperate courage, born from absolute despair. The history of Roman slavery is punctuated by numerous acts of resistance, both small and large. The smallest acts might be passive resistance feigning illness, deliberately working slowly, breaking tools, or pilfering food. These were quiet, everyday forms of defiance, often carrying harsh punishments if discovered, but offering a small measure of control in an otherwise controlled existence. Imagine the subtle ways you might slow down your work just enough to avoid a beating. A tiny act of rebellion in a vast system. But then there were the larger, more organized acts of rebellion. The most famous, of course, is the Spartacus Rebellion, 73-71 BCE. Spartacus, a Thracian gladiator, along with fellow gladiators and slaves, escaped from a gladiatorial school in Capua. What began as a small band quickly swelled into a massive army of desperate men and women, numbering in the tens of thousands, perhaps even over 100,000, who for 2 years terrorized the Italian peninsula. They defeated several Roman legions, pillaged the countryside, and demonstrated a terrifying capacity for organized warfare. Think about the sheer audacity of this revolt. These were not trained soldiers, but slaves, gladiators, and rural laborers, forging themselves into a fighting force against the might of Rome. They fought with whatever they could find: farm implements, improvised weapons, captured Roman arms. Spartacus, a brilliant tactician, led them to astonishing victories. Their goal was often escape, to reach lands beyond Roman control, or simply to take revenge on their former masters. The sheer terror this rebellion struck into the heart of Rome is hard to overstate. It threatened the very foundation of their society. One less-known fact about slave rebellions is that they were not always led by charismatic figures like Spartacus. There were numerous smaller, localized uprisings, particularly on large agricultural estates or in mines, where conditions were most brutal. These often involved desperate slaves seizing weapons and attacking their overseers or masters, driven by immediate grievances. While often quickly suppressed and brutally punished, they highlight the constant simmer of discontent beneath the surface of Roman society. Historians still debate the specific motivations and long-term goals of some of these smaller revolts, often hampered by limited Roman records, which naturally downplayed such events. The Roman response to slave rebellions was always swift, brutal, and utterly uncompromising. The state viewed any slave uprising as an existential threat, and their suppression was carried out with extreme prejudice. After Spartacus's final defeat, 6,000 captured rebels were crucified along the Appian Way from Capua to Rome, a horrifying spectacle meant to serve as a permanent, chilling warning to any who dared to defy the power of Rome. Imagine seeing that horrific display, the silent testament to failed rebellion. The fear of slave revolt was a constant undercurrent in Roman society. Wealthy Romans employed various measures to prevent them, from surveillance and internal slave hierarchies, as mentioned before, to keeping slaves of diverse origins together to prevent them from communicating easily. Laws were harsh, and punishments for perceived insubordination or conspiracy were severe. This pervasive fear shaped many aspects of daily life for both master and slave. While slave rebellions rarely achieved lasting success in overthrowing the institution of slavery itself, they served as powerful reminders of the inherent injustice of the system and the immense human cost. They forced Romans to confront the brutality upon which their society was built, even if they ultimately reaffirmed their control through even greater violence. The ghost of Spartacus, in particular, haunted Roman consciousness for centuries. Think about the psychological resilience required not only to resist, but simply to endure. Even without open rebellion, maintaining a sense of self, a spark of hope, or even just quiet dignity in the face of absolute dehumanization was an act of profound resistance in itself. The countless untold stories of quiet acts of defiance, of secret networks of communication, or of simply enduring through the unthinkable, are as much a part of this story as the grand, tragic rebellions. The roar of rebellion, though often silenced, was a powerful, terrifying sound for the Roman elite. It reminded them that their vast empire, built on the backs of the enslaved, was always vulnerable to the very foundation it rested upon. And for the enslaved, it offered a brief, desperate glimmer of hope, a moment where the shackles of fear were cast off, however fleetingly. You're no longer surrounded by the echoes of rebellion or the grim spectacle of the slave market. Instead, you're drifting forward in time, past the peak of Rome's imperial power, witnessing a slow, almost imperceptible shift. The iron grip of slavery, while still present, begins to loosen, not with a sudden snap, but with a gradual, centuries-long erosion. This is the complex and often debated story of the shadow of slavery's end in the Roman world. A decline driven by economic shifts, changing social norms, and the sheer inefficiency of maintaining such a vast human enterprise. Imagine the Roman Empire in its later centuries. From the 3rd to the 5th CE and beyond, the massive influx of war captives, which had fueled the expansion of slavery in the Republic and early Empire, began to dwindle. Rome was no longer conquering vast new territories at the same pace. This meant a reduction in the supply of cheap, readily available new slaves, leading to an increase in their price. This simple economic factor was a powerful force in slavery's gradual decline. Owning a large number of slaves became less economically viable for many Roman landowners and businessmen. Think about the changing nature of the Roman military and economy. As the empire stabilized its borders, the focus shifted from constant conquest to defense and internal administration. The vast latifundia, while still existing, faced new challenges. Maintaining a massive slave workforce required constant supervision, food, clothing, and the suppression of revolts. It was, in many ways, an inefficient system compared to new forms of labor. You can almost hear the quiet calculations of Roman landowners, weighing the costs and benefits of slave labor versus other options. This economic shift led to the rise of colonate. You might find yourself as a colonist, a tenant farmer who was legally tied to the land but not a slave. You paid rent in labor or produce to the landowner and couldn't leave the estate. While still a form of bondage, it offered more rights and personal autonomy than outright slavery. The colonist system provided landowners with a stable, albeit less exploited, workforce. And it gradually replaced chattel slavery as the dominant form of agricultural labor in many regions. It was a step, however small, away from outright human ownership. One less-known detail is the role of Christianity in the decline of Roman slavery. While early Christianity did not explicitly condemn slavery, and many early Christians owned slaves, its emphasis on spiritual equality and the inherent dignity of all human beings gradually fostered an environment where the institution of chattel slavery began to be viewed with increasing moral discomfort. Over centuries, Christian emperors and bishops issued laws that, while not abolishing slavery, aimed to improve the treatment of slaves, facilitate manumission, and restrict some of the harsher aspects of the institution. Historians still debate the true causal impact of Christianity versus economic and social factors, often concluding it was a contributing, but not sole, force. Consider the practicalities. As the empire faced barbarian incursions and internal instability, the logistics of maintaining vast numbers of slaves became more challenging. Runaways might find easier refuge in fragmented territories, and the state had fewer resources to dedicate to their recapture. The discipline of the master also faced new strains as the traditional Roman social order began to fracture. You might notice the subtle ways the traditional power structures are eroding around you, making the old ways of control harder to enforce. The concept of debt bondage also changed over time, becoming less common as outright chattel slavery and the colonate system took precedence. While poverty still forced many into desperate situations, the direct and legal enslavement for debt largely faded from prominence. It's a small victory, but a victory nonetheless, for the vulnerable. The decline was not uniform across the vast Roman Empire. Slavery persisted longer and in different forms in various regions, particularly in the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, where urban and specialized slavery remained more prevalent. The story of slavery's end is not a single, dramatic event, but a mosaic of localized changes and gradual shifts over centuries. You might see pockets where the old ways clung on, even as new systems emerged elsewhere. Historians still grapple with the question of whether Roman slavery ever truly ended or simply evolved into new forms of coerced labor, like serfdom in the medieval period. The transition was often blurred, with colony occupying a legal space between slave and free peasant. This academic discussion highlights the complex and long-lasting nature of servitude in human history, often simply changing its name and precise legal definition rather than disappearing entirely. You can almost feel the unresolved nature of this historical question. Lingering like a ghost, the shadow of Roman slavery, though gradually receding, cast a long and chilling pall over the subsequent centuries. Its economic structures, its legal precedents, and its very concept of human ownership influenced later societies, including those that would eventually give rise to the transatlantic slave trade. The painful lessons of the gladius are not simply those of conquest, but of the moral and ethical cost of building an empire on the backs of human beings. So, as the sun sets on the Roman Empire, it also slowly dims on the widespread institutional chattel slavery that defined so much of its existence. It wasn't a sudden liberation, but a slow, often agonizing, shift, leaving behind a legacy of both technological advancement and immense human suffering, forever etched into the annals of history. You're no longer observing the slow, centuries-long fade of Roman slavery. Instead, you're standing at a vantage point high above time, looking back, then forward, tracing the indelible lines that Roman servitude etched onto the canvas of history. The echoes of servitude, though muted by millennia, still resonate, influencing the way societies have organized labor, justified hierarchy, and ultimately shaped the very concept of human freedom. Imagine a world built on the principle that some human beings could be owned, used, and disposed of like tools. Roman slavery, in its vast scale and sophisticated legal framework, provided a powerful, chilling blueprint for later forms of forced labor. The idea of res, human property, became deeply embedded, not just in Roman law, but in the collective legal and philosophical consciousness of the Western world. You can almost feel the chilling weight of that historical precedent, a concept so deeply rooted it took centuries to dislodge. Think about the economic implications. Rome's reliance on slave labor allowed for massive public works, large-scale agriculture, and the accumulation of vast wealth by the elite. This model of economic development, fueled by coerced labor, had both immediate benefits and long-term drawbacks. It disincentivized technological innovation in some areas, as cheap human labor often made machines unnecessary, but it also created monumental achievements, forever tying the grandeur of Rome to the suffering of its enslaved population. One striking, yet often unacknowledged, legacy is how Roman law and philosophy inadvertently contributed to later justifications of slavery. While later thinkers would condemn the practice, the very existence of a detailed Roman legal framework for human ownership provided a ready-made template for societies that would eventually engage in their own forms of chattel slavery, most notably the transatlantic slave trade. The meticulously catalogued rights and non-rights of Roman slaves, though from a different era, provided a chilling legal precedent. Historians still debate the direct legal lineage from Roman slavery to later forms, but the intellectual and philosophical groundwork is undeniable. Consider the social stratification. Roman society was rigidly hierarchical, and slavery formed the absolute bottom rung, defining what it meant to be truly unfree. This clear distinction between free and unfree, between citizen and property, left a lasting imprint on social structures that persisted for centuries, evolving into feudal systems and other forms of serfdom where individuals were tied to land or lord, if not outright owned. You can almost see the shadow of the libertus, the freedman, lingering, a testament to the persistent stigma of former bondage. The psychological impact of slavery, both on the enslaved and the enslaver, also casts a long shadow. For the enslaved, it was generations of trauma, dehumanization, and the constant struggle for dignity. For the enslavers, it fostered a culture of absolute power, entitlement, and often brutality, which permeated aspects of Roman society. These psychological patterns, though not directly inherited, created precedents for power dynamics that would reappear in different forms throughout history. The very concept of citizenship in Rome was defined, in part, by the existence of its opposite, slavery. Being a Roman citizen meant possessing rights, autonomy, and a place in the social order that was starkly contrasted with the utterly unfree status of a slave. The brilliance of Roman citizenship was highlighted by the dark background of pervasive servitude. One fascinating, yet complex, aspect of the Roman legacy is the concept of manumission itself. While it was not widespread enough to dismantle the institution, the very idea that a slave could, however rarely, achieve freedom and even partial citizenship was unique compared to some other ancient slave societies. This Roman flexibility, while still deeply flawed, provided a glimmer of a pathway out, a concept that would be debated and reinterpreted in later historical contexts. This unique feature often sparks scholarly arguments about whether Roman slavery was truly different or just differently awful. The whispers of resistance, of the Spartacus rebellion, also echo through time. They serve as a powerful reminder that human beings, regardless of their chains, will always yearn for freedom and often, when pushed to the brink, fight fiercely for it. These stories of defiance became inspirations for later movements against oppression, highlighting the enduring human spirit in the face of insurmountable odds. As the quiet hum of our story fades, ponder the lasting legacy of Roman slavery. It's a sobering reminder that the foundations of even the most magnificent civilizations can be built on immense human suffering. It urges us to critically examine the concepts of freedom, ownership, and human dignity, and to recognize that the past, even its most terrible secrets, continues to shape our present. The ghost of Roman servitude, though ancient, still whispers lessons about the cost of power and the enduring value of liberty.